The monologue you're about to see and hear was recorded the day before the former Cambridge University professor Jason Arday died. We decided at the time to cancel the broadcast because to do otherwise felt wrong. Jason Arday was married with 2 young children. For some people, that puts what I'm about to say beyond the pale. And if you are someone who believes that it behoves us never to speak ill of the dead, then I urge you to stop watching, because you may find what I'm about to say disrespectful or tasteless, and I do not seek to upset anyone needlessly. Arday's death prompted some people to accuse people like me on the right of hounding a vulnerable man to death, that he'd broken no laws, and yet faced a level of scrutiny he wouldn't have were he white. To these people I say, journalists are not police officers. We don't investigate or publicise on the basis of criminal wrongdoing. The public interest is wider than that. And as for his colour, it's why the story mattered. There are plenty of white men who've lied about their abilities and been promoted beyond them. But what made the Arday story so significant was what it told us about a systemic change which has made institutions like Cambridge University bend over backwards to increase diversity without caring about the downsides. Not just the able white candidates who don't get the jobs they deserve, but in this case a black man who came to symbolise the degradation of an entire system and who tragically was unable to cope with the unwanted attention which eventually came his way when the truth about his shortcomings came out. There are now those who seek to weaponise Arday's death. They talk about a right-wing media pile-on. But what, I wonder, would they change? If they felt there were too many stories appearing in the press about Arday, how would anyone decide when the media had breached its quota? Who would ring up the editor of the Daily Mail to say, "No more Arday stories, you've reached your limit"? In a free society, we allow journalists to decide what a story is and how many stories they should tell. They select the subject. Nothing, theoretically at least, is off limits, no matter how uncomfortable that might make someone feel. It doesn't work this way in China or Russia or Iran, where paid propagandists write and broadcast on behalf of the state, where some stories are suppressed. It's not a total free-for-all in Britain. There are libel laws to deter out-and-out lies, and it's worth noting that, as I go on to explain in my monologue, those libel laws were invoked to stop legitimate scrutiny of Jason Arday. His supporters argue he was hounded, but the hounding, such as it was very much a two-way street. More than 20 years ago, a friend and colleague of mine took his own life after a campaign of media vilification led not by the right-wing press, but by the BBC and The Guardian. They alleged he'd faked a report, used the wrong footage, to illustrate a story about the Gulf War, which was then raging. It was a relatively minor mistake, but my friend lost his job, and 2 months later he committed suicide. It left a very bad taste. Sky TV, where my colleague was employed, had, in my opinion, hung him out to dry, much as Cambridge University did with Jason Arday. And as for The Guardian and the BBC, I thought their journalism was shoddy and motivated by a desire to do down a commercial rival. But I would never have sought to challenge their right in a democracy to write about a story which they felt raised important issues about standards. The coverage of the Jason Arday saga, coverage which includes the monologue we're about to play, also raises important points of public interest. We should be suspicious of those who seek to decide what is and is not legitimate commentary. This is a tale of 2 teachers, one white, one black. Both lost their jobs after a row, different rows at different times, about race. One for telling the truth, the other, allegedly, for being less than truthful. You will almost certainly have heard of one of them because he's been much in the news this last fortnight. His name is Jason Arday. He's 41, and in 2023 he became the youngest black professor to be appointed by Cambridge University. A man who, how can I put this without having the lawyers at my back, gilded the lily of his life to make it sound like a Homeric struggle against adversity. Arday, if you don't mind, I won't prefix his name with an honorific, created a story about himself which some white people were desperate to hear. That, as a boy and the child of African immigrants, he faced racial bigotry and every possible impediment to self-improvement. That he could not even read or write until his late teens, but somehow, against all the odds, he rose to the very top. The other teacher you may not be familiar with, partly because of history, but also geography. His name, Ray Honeyford. He never worked amid the dreamy spires of Cambridge University. Instead, he toiled without recognition as a head teacher in Bradford, my hometown. And even though Bradford was last year named the UK's City of Culture, Bradford and Cambridge are very different places. What happens in Cambridge makes headlines, Bradford not so much. But these two men and what happened to them, I think, tells us something profound about where we are headed as a nation. This tale of two teachers could almost be a parable for our times. It's a story separated by more than 40 years, but with parallels that can't be ignored today, I think. The key date here is 1985, the year Jason Arday was born, but also the year when Ray Honeyford's career died a death. It was in 1985 that he wrote an article for an obscure conservative magazine, I happen now to be its assistant editor, in which he publicly criticised the policy of multiculturalism, which, he said, was harming society and the prospects of the Pakistani heritage pupils who, even then, made up 90% of his school intake. I'll come to what he said and what happened next in a moment, but I want to start by making this point. Ray Honeyford was hounded from his job, accused of being an out-of-touch authority figure and, worse, a racist. Were he still alive, he died in 2012, he would be accused of having what we've come to call white privilege. But nothing could have been further from the truth. Ray Honeyford, like Jason Arday, was also the child of immigrants, Irish, not African. His father was an unskilled labourer who, after he was wounded fighting in the trenches of World War I, struggled to support his wife and 10 children. Honeyford was one of only 4 who survived into adulthood. This big family grew up in a small family home, a terraced house in Manchester. Unlike Jason Arday, Ray Honeyford did not claim to have been unable to read or write until he turned 18, but he did grow up in a home which was not conducive to learning, possessing neither an inside toilet nor any book beyond the Bible. Neither did Ray Honeyford benefit from the springboard which traditionally helped catapult poor, clever kids into a higher educational orbit. Honeyford failed the 11+. There was no grammar school for him. He left school at 15. But he had something, a desire to get on. He got an office job, he went to night school, and he trained against the odds to become a teacher. He even went to university, not Cambridge, but Lancaster, just up the M6 from Manchester. Ray Honeyford was the sort of Mancunian that our Prime Minister and Cambridge graduate, Andy Burnham, should be proud of. Once he qualified as a teacher, Ray Honeyford taught at a succession of secondary schools in poorer parts of Manchester. He believed that education had allowed him to flourish, and it could help others born into poverty too. Eventually, a head teacher's job came up on the other side of the Pennines in Bradford, and 4 years into that headship, he wrote the piece that would end his career. He was paid nothing for the article. Jason Arday, by contrast, this month told The Guardian that he's been paid $1.4 million for his memoirs. Arday's book, assuming it goes on sale as planned at the end of this month, will be placed alongside other autobiographies, but perhaps it really belongs in the fiction section because so much of Jason Arday's life is not what it seems or what he wanted people to believe it was. Let me list the ways. I'll start with his writing. In theory, the book due out later this month is not Jason Arday's first. He claimed to have published another called Being Young, Black and Male, Challenging the Dominant Discourse, except that the publisher, Palgrave Macmillan, later made clear they'd never actually published it. He also reportedly claimed to have been a visiting professor at Ohio and Glasgow. Neither university reportedly knew anything about this. Jason Arday also gave us to understand that he had a master's in psychodynamic practices from the University of London, but the university apparently has no record of any such postgraduate study. This emerging pattern of academic embellishment might have gone unnoticed had Jason Arday's success not been so stratospheric. After school, he studied at a former teacher training college in Twickenham and then at an erstwhile polytechnic in Liverpool. Armed with these credentials, and in part thanks to the post-George Floyd hysteria, which so disfigured the early part of this decade, he landed his plum job at Cambridge. But he also drew attention to himself. He'd left school with 2 GCSEs, one in textiles, the other in PE. But within a few years, he was the diversity pin-up boy for one of the world's great universities. Once there, he was trotted out as proof that Cambridge University was diverse and inclusive. But the problem for people who pull the wool over the eyes of others is that they don't seem to know when to stop. Jason Arday claimed to have been a victim of racism, and he wrote and spoke about this often. It seems to have been part of his shtick. He said that after he'd got the job at Cambridge, he'd been threatened by a masked man with a knife. Bananas and bullets were addressed to him. His parents in South London, he said, were sent the severed head of a pig. When a sceptical Guardian journalist tried to verify these claims, Arday replied, "I thought you just believed me." He claimed to have run 30 marathons in 35 days, at times with a broken leg, and to have played for Crystal Palace. I don't think all at the same time, but it's difficult to know for sure. He claimed to have had testicular cancer and brain tumours. He claimed to having been hit by a car and left in a coma which lasted for months. His parents were told his life support machine should be turned off as an act of mercy. He recovered, of course, but only after surviving locked-in syndrome. Arday also claimed to have visited South America and West Africa, there to help get fresh water running for the locals on behalf of the charity Water Aid. But when the charity was asked about this, they said they would never send volunteers abroad. He even claimed to have appeared in a long-running TV documentary called 7 Up, which was first aired years before he was actually born. We've all known, perhaps you've known, people who can be a little bit economical with the actuality. Folk who like to add a little sprinkle of stardust to a story, or indeed a CV. They're almost a comforting comic stereotype in literature and film. One of the most famous movie depictions of this inclination was Billy Liar, starring Tom Courtenay and Julie Christie, 2 of the biggest stars on screen in the 1960s. Funnily enough, the film, it's based on a story by Keith Waterhouse, was set in Bradford. Anyone looking at the trailer for Billy Liar, you can find it on YouTube, will struggle to recognise the Bradford in which the film is set. 50 years ago, Bradford was still a predominantly white city with job vacancies in the textile mills, which were just beginning to be filled by large numbers of men from Pakistan. But 2 decades later, by the 1980s, parts of the city had altered beyond recognition. One such suburb, Manningham, was where Ray Honeyford became a headmaster. And he was good at what he did. His school was oversubscribed and well run, but Ray Honeyford was worried that Bradford Council was making it harder for pupils to learn and integrate. The council, you see, was an early adopter, as an official policy of municipal governance, of multiculturalism, the idea that all cultures are equal, of equal value, and should be treated thus. Put like that, it sounds laudable and equitable. Who could object? But the reality was different. Young Muslim girls, for one thing, were at a disadvantage. Parents stopped them from taking part in some classes, like drama. Some just disappeared halfway through a term, sent to Pakistan to visit relatives or be auctioned off to a cousin for an arranged marriage. As headmaster, Ray Honeyford tried to hold a public meeting to address these problems. The meeting descended into chaos. So he wrote an article, first for the Times Education Supplement, the newspaper for teachers, and when that didn't work, he penned his piece for the Salisbury Review, the Conservative quarterly founded and at the time still edited by the philosopher Roger Scruton. In it, he argued that free speech was being eroded by a race relations industry that shut down debate with accusations of racism. So much of what happened then feels familiar today. Within days, the protests had begun. Crowds of Pakistani heritage men gathered outside the school gates. One banner bore a slogan saying, "Honeyford writes in the blood of blacks." Youngsters wore badges with the words, "Hate your headmaster," on them. Ray Honeyford was, they said, racist. Honeyford was ordered on a mandatory race awareness course. The mayor, the first Asian mayor in Britain, demanded his resignation. There was a court hearing, which Honeyford won, but the pressure for him to go kept coming, along by now with the death threats. When one local Sikh shopkeeper privately expressed his support, Honeyford urged him to speak out. The shopkeeper said he couldn't because he feared that his shop would be burned down. Eventually, Ray Honeyford agreed to go, and he never taught again. He'd warned that Manningham was becoming a Pakistani ghetto, and people in Bradford were growing further apart, not closer together. His words were prophetic, and this summer marks the 25th anniversary of the Bradford race riot, the worst rioting ever by British Asians, in which 300 police officers were injured. Manningham bore the brunt and was the epicentre of that violence. The school where Ray Honeyford was head, it's still there, but it's got a new name, taken from the Quran. When the author Ed Hussein visited the school, and Manningham too, for his brave and shocking book Among the Mosques, published in 2022, he concluded that Bradford increasingly was a place of monoculturalism, not multiculturalism, because the only people who lived there were Muslims. There is a black and white picture of Ray Honeyford from the 1980s outside his school, Drummond Middle School, as it was then, flanked by some of his young pupils. Bespectacled and besuited, he looks like a man happy in his work, the sort of earnest public servant who doesn't much care for public acclaim or riches. By contrast, in this tale of two teachers, there are many, many pictures of Jason Arday. Where Honeyford was shunned, Arday has been feted. Where Honeyford was hounded for daring to speak the truth, Arday was lionised for saying what people wanted to hear, even if it wasn't necessarily strictly accurate. Such was the enthusiasm for Jason Arday's story that he was asked to carry an Olympic torch and be guest editor of the BBC's flagship Today programme. But it was his elevation to a professorship at Cambridge which tells us how far guilty white liberals are prepared to debase the currency of high standards in order to appear virtuous. Cambridge University, let us not forget, is the university of Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin. It routinely appears in the world's top 5 of the world's most prestigious universities. Its academics have been awarded nearly 50 more Nobel Prizes than the whole of France. But Jason Arday found it almost comically easy to secure a top job there. His academic credentials were paper-thin, but the 9 members of the Board of Electors, chaired not by a lifelong academic but by a former Labour minister, seemed desperate to wave him through. 2 of the board's members, coincidentally, had previously attacked whiteness in education. Jason Arday's body of work, if I can call it that, routinely presented Britain as a place of systemic racism, where it was almost impossible for non-white people to succeed. He seems to have done, by the way, not only to have succeeded, but to have overlooked the fact that about half of black 18-year-olds go to university, while only 30% of their white counterparts do. So much for structural racism. After he got the gig, Jason Arday did an interview with his new boss. It was a fawning, cringeworthy bit of TV broadcast by the BBC, obviously, in which Arday is told that he is the best in the world in terms of research. But not everyone believed his story. At the Times higher education newspaper, a journalist called Jack Grove started digging around. There was a suggestion that Jason Arday had plagiarised part of his PhD, that not all the work he'd done was from the sweat of his own dreadlocked brow. But some powerful people who talk a lot about oppression, have invested in Jason Arday, and they came after this journalist. An expensive libel lawyer was hired, and the police got involved. The Met told the journalist to lay off Jason Arday. The boss of the Met later apologised for what looked like an attempt to stifle free speech. And yet it's worth saying that Jason Arday still has his cheerleaders, people who simply point-blank refuse to engage with the mounting evidence that Arday was a charlatan. Labour MPs have rallied to his colours. The Green Party leader, the prodigiously inept Zach Polanski, said there was an orchestrated campaign by the right-wing press to smear Jason Arday. I find I'm rather attached to the right-wing press, not always. The Daily Mail, for instance, has previously been pretty uncharitable to me. But without their scepticism, their curiosity, their cussed refusal to bow down before the libel lawyers and the threats of police involvement, this story wouldn't have seen the light of day. And Arday would not have, as he did this month, resigned his professorship. But this story, this tale of two teachers, it's bigger than that. Ray Honeyford was a very early, perhaps the very first, public servant to blow the whistle on the corrupting effects of multiculturalism. 40 years later, Jason Arday represents its end point, its apotheosis, by which I mean Jason Arday and the people who put him on a pedestal held up by thin air stand for an end to Western empiricism. That sounds like a big claim. What on earth do I mean? I mean that the people who believe in critical race theory, who teach and lecture about white privilege or white fragility, they argue in places like universities that there is something inherently white in being obsessively attached to things like data and facts and rigour. I look at a well-researched newspaper article in The Spectator or The Times, and I see claims tested to destruction. I see a determination to expose that which is meretricious. But others, the race grifters who have built careers and fortunes telling the rest of us how racist we are, they don't see a desire to get to the truth. They see only smears. This should worry all of us. We are entering a phase in our island story where the things that set Britain apart are beginning to wither. The institutions, not just universities, but especially universities, which were once paragons of unflashy, understated achievement, which showed the importance, or showed the world the importance of exactitude and precision, they're now becoming places where what matters is empty show, expressions of feelings and lived experience. That even Cambridge, the British university which gave us Professor Stephen Hawking's cosmology, the university which saw Watson and Crick crack DNA, that even Cambridge, with its reputation as our greatest university of science, should now submit to the vague and made-up rules of identity politics and race-baiting is a national tragedy, and we should all lament that, whether we went to university or not. When I thought about the ease with which some people like Arday play the victim card, I thought of the other teacher of my tale. I thought of Ray Honeyford, who, for all that his determination to speak truth to power cost him dear, never dissolved into self-pity. And I thought of somebody else. Like Jason Arday, she was both black and a professor, not in Britain, but at one of America's greatest universities, Stanford, in California. She grew up in 1950s Alabama, where people were officially segregated on race grounds, ordered to use different bathrooms or schools according to their skin colour. As a child, one of her closest friends was killed when segregationists blew up her local Baptist church. But none of this held her back. She never played the victim card or the race card. She didn't overstate the obstacles she faced, and she excelled in things which required precision and rigour and application. She became a concert pianist, incredibly difficult. She was a concert pianist. She once played a concert for our own late Queen Elizabeth II, and she became a fluent speaker in Russian. This is the woman I'm talking about, Condoleezza Rice. I interviewed her in Lisbon 20 years ago. At the time, she was the US Secretary of State. No black woman had ever risen to a position of such authority in the world's greatest superpower. Only Kamala Harris, a woman of infinitely less talent, rose further when she became Joe Biden's vice president years later. My point is that nobody needs to gild the lily to get on in life. Not really. You don't need to be a Billy Liar to succeed. As Condi Rice reminded me, you just need to work incredibly hard and prove to people that you are capable. But it's become fashionable, especially since the George Floyd terror, for some on the left and the institutions they now control, like the universities and the BBC, to blame any failure to succeed on the privilege of others, and there is no greater privilege than being born white. This would have come as a shock to Ray Honeyford, in his tiny childhood terrace with his dead siblings and broken father. This noxious idea that to be born white is to be born better off. What it succeeds in doing, this new religion of critical race theory, this study of whiteness, is to create a gap for people of limited talent but limitless brass neck like Jason Arday to shin up the pole. It also does something really, really corrosive. It allows people to avoid taking responsibility for their own shortcomings, their own lack of talent or persistence, because they can always blame their lack of success on racism or transphobia or ableism or Islamophobia. And it stops the rest of us from understanding, even discussing, which things might really be holding people back. It's no coincidence, I think, that Condi Rice grew up in a church-going home with two parents who stayed married for life. Not something many young black men and women in the US or UK can take for granted anymore. And yet to mention that a culture of fatherlessness might be the reason why, for instance, a disproportionate number of young black men end up not at university, but in prison, is to say the unsayable. But if you're brave enough, and I'm not, by the way, nothing's unsayable. It took one dogged journalist who went at the truth like a heat-seeking missile to rumble Jason Arday. And it took one headmaster in my hometown of Bradford to warn that one day, long after he'd gone, the policies of multiculturalism would sow the seeds of bloody future conflict. Bye for now. At Outpost, we are committed to free speech and shining a light on untold stories that matter. To support our documentaries, reports and podcasts, please like, share and subscribe to our work on Substack, YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Thank you.